Three, two, one. All right. Hello. Thank you very much, Mr. David Grubbs, for joining us on the Lameme Young Patreon video lecture podcast, whatever you want to call it.
All right. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So you and I go back quite a bit as sensei and pupil. As a professor and student at Brooklyn College, where you've been in the CUNY system over a decade now, right?
15, trapped in the CUNY system for 15 years.
Trapped to the benefit of people like me who
No, I'm not trapped in the CUNY system, but something about, in the system, suggested searching for an exit.
No.
Which is not the case.
It's not the case, but
I've happily,
in
more
the
or less
system,
happily been teaching it in the CUNY system for 15 years.
Gotcha. We know it's just the acknowledgement that it is a system, as any giant public institution would be.
The largest urban public university in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. Go Brooklyn Bulldogs. That's our mascot, right?
I think so, yeah.
I think so. I don't know. I went to a couple basketball games as an undergrad for fun. So you were my professor, and now you are a dear friend. And I appreciate you coming on because, like I just mentioned to you, our relationship in the formal sense has been a lot of me answering questions and describing in detail things for you of my own work, as one would in private lessons, and the history of sound art class, which I took of yours, which you've taught forever. Since when I started as an undergrad in 2012, I tried to sign up for it, but I transferred in with way too many electives, so I just didn't try to get into it. But I had known of that particular class from day one as a CUNY undergraduate. Mm-hmm. So taking that class was for me, at least in some way, like an intro to some sound studies outside of the music conversation, which has shaped a lot of my ideas and a lot of the meme page as well. So I wanted to field you some questions for once that I think that talking about your work and your life as a artist, musician, composer, poet, writer. Of course, we have to talk about the writing as well. That's a huge. It's all intertwined. I have a feeling it's all intertwined, but we will confirm. Just want to talk about your output and see if so the folks here can gain some insight into someone whose work is seminal, if I do say so. I think there is there's a legacy historically that has been documented, not only with you, but the communities that you have embedded yourself in throughout your career. So I wanted to start actually with with Kentucky, with Louisville, because I had just recently rewatched the Slint documentary, the Spiderland doc. And I recognized your Brooklyn College office in the movie immediately. And I was like, I used to sit there. So I wanted, just for those that don't know, if you could give us just a little background of maybe like your musical, confirm or deny if this is your sort of initial sort of growth to some sort of artistic fruition, if this was like the first place that really was your first sort of as a young adult or even child in some cases. If you could tell us about Louisville and the community that you surrounded yourself with there.
Yeah, so I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I really first connected with the punk rock scene in Louisville around 1981. I was born in 1967, so in 1979 I was a kid who was like completely into the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin and the Who. I played piano, I played guitar, all of this stuff, and I was reading Rolling Stone magazine, and it suddenly dawned on me, reading articles by Greil Marcus and Tom Carson and people like this, that like, oh yeah, Led Zeppelin, this is like 10 years ago, this is like ancient history, what's happening now? And so I was reading reviews of The Clash and Public Image Limited and The Gang of Four. Right. I bought The Gang of Four's Entertainment like the week that it came out when I was probably 13 years old. And then just from sort of like hanging out in record stores, I realized there were local fanzines, and that there were punk bands like Circle X and the Babylon Dance Band and the End Tables from Louisville. All those folks were like 10 or 15 years older than I was. And so it was sort of me just like checking it out from afar, but being very interested in the culture of the fanzine and the relation between like what was happening in my own medium-sized city, right. And how that could be as like wild or as radical as what was happening anywhere else. Right. And so the next kind of wrinkle was hardcore punk. In like 1980, I don't even know what year the movie came out, but like in 1983 or 84, the movie The Decline played in Louisville, at the art house cinema that was owned by Drew Daniels' stepfather. Oh, wow. And, people were like slam dancing in the aisles, and like everybody you met there had just started a band. And I had met the people who were in a band called Languid and Flaccid. So Brian McMahon, Britt Walford, people like that, who were later in Slint. Yeah. And both of whom played in Squirrelbait, which was a band that I played in. Right. So I played in a new wave band, but then like it was sort of like our moment, like age 14 or 15. Right. When it was less like looking up to this original generation of art school punks in Louisville, and it's more like, like you're 14 years old and you're playing in a thrash band, and like that's as relevant as it gets, Right. And everybody edited a fanzine, Ned Oldham, who was Will Oldham's older brother, and I don't know, just everybody did a fanzine. And we first started Squirrelbait first started playing out of town around that time when I was like 16. So we opened for Husker Du. We played with Big Black. We played with Articles of Faith. We would drive to Newport, Kentucky, which is like, the kind of like trashy across the river, like sin and vice zone outside of Cincinnati. We just played in like an old biker bar there called the Jockey Club, or kind of old person's bar. Anyway, so I don't know, why Louisville? I don't know, but the first wave of Louisville punk bands I thought were like completely original, sort of mind-blowing bands. And I, to this day strongly recommend that people check out Circle X and the End Tables. And, you just can't deny it. Like, it's amazing music. And it's also a really kind of original take on punk and noise. Right. I don't know. So, Circle X were like a fucking noise band. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the only reference points that we had, as 13 or 14-year-olds in Louisville in 1982, were things like, I don't know, the first Meat Puppets EP, or I don't know. We're already getting into inside baseball, but I don't know. The fact of the matter was that it was a really kind of amazing group of people. There was an art school in Louisville that that was the breeding ground for punk in its first instance in Louisville.
Wasn't it there was a high school too that was pretty like creative arts, just from the
so most of the people who were in Slint and right. in Squirrelbait and a bunch of bands all went to the Brown School, which was like a very experimental public school. I went to a much more boring traditional high school. But yeah, all my friends went to the Brown School, where everybody called their teachers by their first names and stuff like that. Kind of like,
that tells a lot.
Weird hippie school in Louisville, but it was a public school. I mean, in downtown Louisville, it wasn't like a fancy private school. Right.
It wasn't one of those test-in, seemingly progressive, but $60,000 a year for freshman year of high school situation.
No, I don't know. So yeah, I just felt like people held one another to really high standards. I remember like somebody like Britt Walford, who played drums in Slint, being sarcastic and hilarious and totally cutting, if he thought that bands were bullshit. Like people called bullshit frequently. I don't
Yeah.
know. And people just like were weird and had weird senses of humor and were like dead serious about it. Like
Yeah.
dead serious, and also with just really like inspired, strange takes on things.
So, do you think that's something to do with Louisville just growing up there? Maybe. I mean, I can't state from experience what it's like being like, weird punk rock kids in the 80s in Kentucky. Even if Louisville is, one of many cities there, the idea that you're weirdos in an otherwise, I would assume, like pretty sort of like strict or traditional conservative state. The idea of, I don't know, did that influence the intentionality of trying to be as different, or not, maybe not as different as possible, but as serious and as cutting edge as possible? Because to call Slint, you could look at something like Slint or Squirrelbait even as, post punk, as people like to call it, or then leading up to post rock, which we'll talk about more. But I mean, to me, it just seems like people that take a genre very seriously to where they want it to sound like something they've never heard before. Like, to me, nothing sounds like Squirrelbait or Slint, for that matter, for different reasons. Is that like an intention where it's like, we're gonna do shit that like you've never heard before? If it is, noise, if it is like incredibly quiet, melancholic guitar work, this is a new direction of punk, if you will. Like, is that an intention? Did you feel like that was a natural progression of things, or was it
Yes.
very intentional? Okay, yes, go.
No. There was no manifesto. There was no mission statement. There was no. I mean, it was only later. I think actually, like playing in the Red Cruella, I remember like 15 years later, Mayo Thompson just being like, "Well, what was the point of that?" It's just like, I don't know. Just like sort of like trying to summarize, or like again, like give the mission statement, or the
Right.
Years later people would call it like the elevator pitch, or what, just like the like shorthand description.
Right.
It was totally an organic inductive process, right? It wasn't like a deductive process where you're like, okay, the idea of this band is such and such, and we're going to fulfill that idea. It was so much more like, amusing and amazing your friends, like starting with the friends that you were in a band with.
Right.
So yeah, totally organic, stumbled into it.
That's hard to come by. I mean, as artists, especially now with more beyond zine culture, now with the entire internet, digital music culture, and independent communications amongst younger artists who have access to everything, right?
Yep.
And I mean, anything and everything under the sun, like to have something come organically versus like decisively, like, I want to sound like this thing that I just heard and combine it with this. I feel like I grew up in like the MySpace generation, and it was kind of like there was always a genre under the description, the band name. When finding stuff, there was always you could choose 3 genres to categorize yourself.
Yeah.
And like literally that's how I discovered like, quote, drone, quote, ambient, at age 15 or whatever, which made me want to be like, oh, like maybe I'll use the delay pedal and just do one note like that, like that band's Son. You know what I mean? Like it felt less natural because of the internet and the deciding algorithms, even in the early stage of categorizing things. So I'm envious in some way of having a localized, real grassroots scene such as Louisville in the early '80s, where it was just community and friends pushing each other, and this was the end result.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly like hardcore punk was the authorizing impulse, and like for a long time, I think that most of the bands did sound kind of like by the book thrash bands, and then grew into something stranger. Right. But just the idea of somebody willfully, like ascribing some kind of microgenre to what they do, like this is my ambient project. Still, to me, it's just like, all right, people do that, but like that's not my MO. It just kind of like Yes, it would never occur to me to say like, oh well, this is my like country metal project or whatever. This is
So
my
this
power
is
reggae project.
power reggae.
Yeah,
That's the
Albert Erlin was always threatening to make a power reggae band.
holy shit. I had never heard that is a hilarious made up genre title that I'm so surprised I'd never heard anyone use before. um, there's so many ways that could be interpreted. Power reggae. So you would describe, I guess, your entire output in this case as sort of disregarding pigeonhole to some extent, like feeling like this is your blank sound. It's all Grubbs, or it's
To
all
me, it's all post-punk. Again, and I feel like you and I have probably had this conversation before, but and like to reference the Red Crayola again, the Red Crayola like started in 1966 in Houston, Texas, and they were a psychedelic band. Like
Right.
they were for like heads in Houston, Texas, and even if they never sounded psychedelic after 1970, still like that's the authorizing impulse. Like that's where it came from. Like psychedelia and associated movements were the things that made them relevant in the first place.
Right.
And punk to me was just like the contemporaneous. It was about committing oneself to a music that was like unfolding at that very moment and in no way was retro.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like I was saying, these sort of like self described microgenres kind of give me the hives.
Yeah.
Also, even as a young child, like the word retro
Right.
always just like very unsettling and very disturbing. Just the fact that anybody would, like willingly describe themselves in that way.
That's so.
I don't know. And for me, that was an attitude that was so bound up in punk, that it was just sort of like the opportunity to intervene in what's happening now.
Right.
Obviously, in 2021, that's not what punk means.
Right.
But still, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Call it post-punk. Like I think I've said this before, probably to you, but like in my head, like everything that I do, it's not like, it's not my thumbprint, it's not my name. It's like it's all post-punk. Like that was the big bang for making music in my life, and it's all just sort of about like, trying different things in the aftermath of that explosion.
See, that's the interesting thing is you using the term post-punk, because we have had this conversation in which like that can just mean anything under the umbrella of punk rock that has sort of like, like grafted it in some way and yet moved beyond it sonically or thematically in different ways. But it's such a broad sort of umbrella term to put it under. And journalists still use it, but like, what does punk mean now? What does post-punk mean now in the 21st century? I mean, like I think it's more of a ideology, aesthetic beyond sound at this point of just sort of, rooted in something that is going against some grain and then taking that a step further, because punk.
Yeah. For me, it's post-punk is totally not a genre descriptor. Like it's a description of something that was set into motion.
Right. Right. So it's just sort of like, like describing your era of beginning, like in history, like where you were and then where you moved beyond it. This is where you started. And I love that that's sort of the term that you would put it all under, because I mean it makes sense even with the sound, your sound changing from project to project depending on what you're doing. So this brings up the question that I wanted to ask, which is how do you feel about the big post-rock term? Because this is something that I've never heard you use as a term in person, and probably intentionally, but many have attributed your scene in Louisville as sort of the spark that started this sort of and not just Slint, but then going into Bastro and Gastro Gaster on your end, and your solo work and things like that. But these are not terms that you've necessarily used yourself in describing your work. And nowadays, has less meaning than when Simon Reynolds initially used it. It was Simon Reynolds, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Using post rock.
Yeah, no, I mean, it absolutely made sense at the time to describe, musics that were, like dialed back in like intensity or like testosterone, or that, displaced a singer, or that, the guitar started to take a back seat, or that was kind of like open and curious about remix culture and things like that, and working with the technology of the recording studio. All of those things, like, it's like, yeah, check, check, check. Like, those described a lot of the music that I was playing and that other people were playing. If the term seems irrelevant to me, it's just because, like, it didn't move me in any way.
Right.
It did. I never thought to organize around, like the category of post rock or anything. I don't know. It was just like, that seemed a description rather than like a reason for action.
So I don't know if you've heard, but in like TikTok music culture with Gen Z on the internet, post rock is still a very happening indie rock sort of subgenre, more related to, like, now, like Explosions in the Sky is considered like old school post rock to these kids, which is, hilarious to me. But the idea, they've called it like tremolo core, where it's just like, you know what I mean, like with a lot of delay pedal, where, I think you describing it in the check marks as like sort of dialed back, maybe not necessarily vocals oriented, or instrumental and like dynamic and intensity, not necessarily like the testosterone energy slam dancing you would expect from like a loud section of rock, but it's just interesting now that the term has existed for basically 2 decades at least, and the music that has been used, whether retroactively or contemporarily, to describe it, still has this sort of melancholy maybe related to a lot of the sounds. And I mean, listening for your own solo work, more recent work, for to look into Apple Music or whatever, where it has for the plane where the palace stood, or what's the Creep Mission that came out right when I was studying with you. That was a big one for me at the time of working with you. You would still see this post rock sort of tag underneath it, and I'm wondering if that's just now related to guitar work that is orchestrated or tastefully used beyond the distortion. I like that you use the term testosterone, less testosterone driven, because like, yeah, punk traditionally has this energy, maybe even violence towards it, that like a loud section of Gastra del Sol might create a more melancholic or even like trance-like state, but we're still under the rock category. It's just interesting because to me it just is like now just describing guitar music that pushes boundaries that might have not existed previously, or might not have been utilized before. I don't know. I used to be really into the term, and now it's like, well, it's kind of meaningless now. I don't know. Like,
yeah. I don't know. The term, like when Simon Reynolds first wrote that piece, it sort of felt like it was retrospective already. Like it was like a description after the fact.
Yeah.
Which I think is why I didn't have any particular like strong feelings about it.
Right.
Like, okay, like,
yeah. I guess that's what it is. Interesting. It's just so interesting because like it's not to geek out, but it's just this is the stuff that like in the internet age you kind of have the everything ascribed to a category. Like you just like, I can't tell you how many times it's just like nowadays at least like a hashtag game for discovering new music. on different platforms, and things like TikTok is like a huge part of it,
Yeah.
which is just
But I wouldn't have expected that because I always thought that, like music could like free range itself, when not tethered to the record store. The record store, like, it makes a huge difference if somebody, I'm thinking of like 25 years ago, right?
right.
Bigger, more like mainstream record stores, right? That really sort of like intervened in the culture more. But like if a black artist is filed under R&B rather than pop,
Right.
like it makes a huge difference in
Right.
the era of the record store.
Yeah.
Or if somebody is filed in oldies, rather than pop, like it's it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can totally understand that. I don't know. I think it's this is
Like
what
people
hap-
really fell between the cracks, because of those classifications. Like it's
Yeah.
those were like hard and fast classifications. You got to file the record somewhere.
Right.
But but in cyberspace that doesn't have to happen. But thus it's interesting that the like revenge of the hashtag.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think maybe it has something to do with, control over like means of distributing music, and what we have to do to play the game to get the name out there. And like, it's just unfortunate that like search engine optimization is SEO is like something that like artists have to think about, not just like webmasters for corporations and brands. The idea of a brand as an artist is kind of interchangeable now, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, if you have independent bloggers that will curate things without necessarily relying on like categorizations, but more like aesthetic or tastes. But oftentimes, like, just the easiest way to discover stuff is to go through the very categorized algorithmic sort of platforms, starting with streaming, but then even more so now with social media that incorporates music, because TikTok has the music feature that you can click on the bottom and see what track it is, and then it will show you where you can get it. So people will find out about it, and it will be like 10 artists you should know. And now there are post-rock TikTok pages that are like going through. I'm sure Gastra is at least on there at some point. But it's just an interesting sort of change that even my generation as millennials aren't grasping with fully as much as Gen Z has. For better or worse,
Right.
or worse. But you'll see.
But now it's an interesting answer to this question. Like I might be inclined to say, like, who cares about a term like post rock? What does it matter? But you're explaining to me like why it does matter. Like what the consequences are for having like a name.
Yeah,
to attach.
Because if it objectively gets a younger person into something on a track that 5 years later they're just like, fuck all categorization, but it got me here at one point, that's kind of where I'm at age 30. So I guess that's like, it took some time, but I blame MySpace again for making you put a genre, at least one genre underneath there. It's just categories. So
But you weren't inclined to do like comedy or spoken word or uncategorizable or like whatever like
I think by the end
code scrambling name you could come up with.
At the end of my MySpace time, when everyone's at the end of everyone's MySpace time, probably like 2010 or whatever, I just had other. That was mine, which is I think that was cool enough, because then you click on other.
It's like everything tends towards entropy. Everything tends towards other.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we all get there someday. Other.
Exactly. What is it? Oldies, other, popular music, whatever. It's fascinating. So I wanted to shift gears just slightly because these are like big questions related to like music. Your music and the sound and how we categorize it in general in today's terminology, and shift more towards your writing, because I want to discuss. I always tell private students and my college students now, like as artists, one of the most important things we got to be able to do is like articulate our work, verbally, but also in some sort of written word. And I always attribute that in my brain to you, in a lot of ways, just kind of saying, you got to write this week, about what you're working on, just write, as an exercise of just getting ideas out there out of your head and making them approachable to anybody or potentially anybody.
Yeah. No, that's really one of the challenges, to take your very specialized ideas and make them as accessible to, if you care to make them, like if you care to like connect with people,
Right.
then, the onus is on you to make those ideas comprehensible.